Thank you all very much. And yes, apologies on behalf of my colleagues who weren't able to make it today. But I have stepped in, as you've heard, and hopefully I'll be able to give the presentation some justice. So thank you all for joining. I'll just give you a quick agenda of the presentation. So firstly, we're going to have a look at some of the changes that are put forth in the final RTS. We'll also look at some of the common secure communication information about the open APIs, the open banking, the XS2A. Then we'll look at the strong customer authentication pieces. And finally, we'll go through some conclusions. And hopefully, if there's a little time, happy to field some questions at the end as well. So firstly, let's have a look at some of the changes in the final RTS. Firstly, looking at the open banking APIs, the open standards, the common and secure communication piece of the RTS. What we're looking at here is that the banks must offer either a dedicated interface for third parties, and if they do that, then the TPPs do not need to provide a fallback interface, or the banks do not need to provide a fallback interface to TPPs if the dedicated interface meets certain requirements. So that's mostly around performance and availability. If the dedicated interface does not meet those requirements, then a TPP can use an augmented style of screen scraping, which we'll refer to as screen scraping 2.0. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that a little later on in the presentation. But that can be used to access the bank's standard customer interface to provide an open banking ideal. Next, we can have a look at the strong customer authentication piece. Not many changes here, but there is a new exemption. Payments by corporate users may be exempted from the SCA if the National Competent Authority has a look at the payment mechanisms provided in corporates and that they stand up to scrutiny to similar levels of or enhanced levels over those provided by the SCA. So there may be an exemption there. And there's also a modified exemption. This is quite an important one regarding the creation or amendment of whitelists of trusted beneficiaries. This cannot be done through the TPP interface. This must be done directly through the bank and not via that TPP. Finally, if we have a look, the audits must be carried out by auditors with expertise in IT and payments, and that must be operationally independent from the PSPs. So there's some of the main changes in the final RTS over the previous drafts, etc. So let's have a look through the timelines of PSD2. Back in January 2016, PSD2 entered into force and became applicable on the 13th of January 2018 for those that managed to get it written into their law. And on the 27th of November last year, the RTS was adopted by the European Commission. So what that means is that went into a 3-month scrutiny period with a potential for another 3 months. And that has completed, and the PSD2 RTS went into the official journal of the EU a couple of weeks ago on the 13th of March. What that means is we're now in our transitional period. PSD2 is well and truly underway. And by the 14th of September 2019, the RTS will become fully applicable. But prior to that date, 6 months before, banks must provide documentation and testing for the open interfaces to TPPs. So that's less than a year away now to get the open banking interfaces into a point where they can be tested by TPPs. So that gives you an idea of the timelines that are going forwards. If we have a look in practice, member states' transpositions of the actual PSD2 into their local laws, you can see that several member states are still not managed to do that. So places like Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden have not yet managed to do so, but the UK, Ireland, Germany, France, among others, have managed to get those requirements written into law, so they are applicable within those places. And you can see a link there at the bottom to see what the status of transposition is on a day-by-day basis. So let's have a look at the XS2A interface and the requirements in the RTS. So what do banks have to provide? Well, they have to provide a communication interface to third-party providers that offers three functionalities. Firstly, it must identify the TPP to the bank. This is really important because it negates the current version of screen scraping that's used, where the TPPs can just use credentials of a customer to log in. It must allow a TPP to request and receive information about bank accounts and financial transactions. And it must allow TPPs to initiate financial transactions for payments for PSUs. Also, the communication interface must follow standards set forth by international organizations, so people like the Berlin Group, the Open Banking Working Group in the UK, CAPS, or STET in France, among others. You must use those standards that they're setting forth for providing the open interfaces. And banks must make, as I mentioned before, 6 months prior to the RTS application date, so on the 14th of March next year, technical specifications of the communication interface and the facilities to test available to their TPPs, to the TPPs. So yeah, less than a year to go to do that. So what are the requirements of that communication interface? There's two options: a dedicated API interface or the screen scraping 2.0, the augmented screen scraping as mentioned before. And that dedicated interface is the Open API. So this is the interface that we see most of the organizations looking to implement, and that's using the API route. Now, under option 1, there are the options for the National Competent Authority to exempt an interface fallback to the screen scraping after consultation with the EBA, but they can also revoke that exemption, requiring a bank to provide fallback within 2 months, and that will be based on the performance and availability of the API. So if you provide a strongly performant and available API, then no requirement for the customer interface to TPPs will be made. If that is not the case, or there are problems with your interface, then the customer interface can be used for the screen scraping, and that an example might be if responses for 5 consecutive TPP requests are not met within 30 seconds. The second option is the screen scraping interface, and as I mentioned before, the bank must be able to identify and authenticate the TPP in this scenario. And then the TPP has certain conditions that they have to meet. So they may only access data on minimum disclosure. So that means that the TPP must not be accessing data that is not relevant or required for what they're trying to do. They must keep logs of all their access data for review by the National Competent Authority. And they must be able to justify their usage of the interface to the National Competent Authority. So there are some controls around the TPPs on the screen scraping 2.0. And finally, the TPP must be able to inform the bank about their usage of the interface as well. So that's seen more as the fallback mechanism. It may be in the initial stages that it's used more often while the fully dedicated API interfaces are built. But we are currently foreseeing the majority of organizations, banks, looking to work through dedicated API interfaces. So some of the, one of the most important tenets of the RTS is that there must not be discrimination of TPPs by the banks. So what that means is the banks have to provide a similar experience through a TPP interface as they would directly to their own customers. They must not discriminate against a TPP. So the bank does get to decide when strong customer authentication needs to be applied. But they must allow TPPs to use all the authentication procedures available to their current banking customers. So an example is if a bank provides an EMV solution and a mobile application for accessing the bank services, then via the TPP, they must also be able to use both of those authentication mechanisms. There's no way of blocking off uses of certain authentication mechanisms purely for the banking channel only. And the dedicated interface of the bank must not create obstacles for the TPP. So you must not prevent the use of credentials of banking customers, for example, or impose redirection of TPP's PSU to a banking application for authentication. That's actually slightly contradictory to what you'll see in the next slides, but what it's talking about is it must not be forced. There must be the option for embedded authentication. So if we have a look at some of the models proposed by the Berlin Group, the bank always gets to decide about the authentication model and the mechanisms. So one of the models would be the redirection model, probably one of the more common models that will be followed. And this is where your PSU user will have two applications, one from the TPP and one from the bank. And they will communicate to the TPP and authenticate directly with the bank application. The second model is the embedded model, and this is more in line with the last point I made on the previous slide about the no enforced redirection. It must be possible for the TPP to provide a full embedded solution where there's only one application. This works very well where hardware style of authentication is used. It's much more complex if you're doing software, so we don't see embedded as being very heavily taken up, but it must be at least available. And finally, a decoupled or out-of-band scenario. So this is very similar to the redirection scenario. The difference being that the two apps that the user would have would be one from the TPP and a specific separate authentication app rather than a banking-specific application. So again, we would see potentially quite a lot of take-up of this kind of technology. So moving on from the open interfaces, let's have a look at the strong customer authentication. If we have a look at the classification of those authentication solutions, firstly, we have two-device authentication. This is where the bank provides a second device, such as a physical token or a mobile application, in conjunction with a banking device, an online application on a website, for example. Two-app authentication model, where you have a separated banking app and authentication app, and the one-app authentication model, where you combine the banking app and the authentication app into the one. And finally, the out-of-band model. The out-of-band model is quite tricky, and I'll explain that moving forwards in the next slides. So when is SCA required? Three specific scenarios: when a payer wants to access their online account, when a payer initiates payment, or when they carry out an action through the remote channel that may imply fraud. Those are scenarios where SCA should be enforced at the very least. How should they do that? Well, we need to be able to generate a one-time authentication code using two or more factors or independent elements. So something you have, something you know, something you are, traditional multi-factor authentication. No fallback to a single factor. Doesn't matter if it's a biometric, a loan, a physical token, or a very complex password. It must be a combination of more than one. But there are potential, as I mentioned before, exemptions for corporate payments moving forwards, but that's only exempted if the NCA defines that the level of security is exceeded by those SCA requirements in the RTS in the current corporate payment environment. So let's have a look at dynamic linking or transaction authentication, quite an important piece here. Articles 5.1 and 5.2's requirements are that the authentication code generated shall be specific to the amount of the payment transaction and the payee, and it must ensure confidentiality, authenticity, and integrity of the amount of the transaction and the payee through all phases of authentication. What this means is, in effect, you must be able to sign the actual full pieces of the transaction, so the beneficiary account details and the amount. The second part that's important is the payer must be made aware of the amount of the payment and the transaction of the payee, and again, ensure the confidentiality, authenticity, and integrity of the information displayed to the payer. So this is seeing what you sign. This is where it's very important that the PSU, the end user, is able to see the exact details that they are creating a transaction around. Which solutions comply with this? Well, the 2DA hardware tokens that have the ability to enter transactional information or scan for transactional information and have a trustworthy display. And both the 2DAA and the 2AA or the 1AA apt with a secure channel and security software to detect any overlays. When it comes to out-of-band SMS, if you're containing payment details inside an SMS, you can't ensure the confidentiality and integrity of that information because SMS is not a guaranteed channel and there's no encryption on SMS. So it makes it very difficult to use that out-of-band channel. RTS does not specifically state that SMS cannot be used, but it effectively, with the confidentiality piece, suggests that SMS cannot be used in its standard state. So some questions around the dynamic linking that we've seen. Some common questions is, which data can be used as beneficiary ID? All or part of the IBAN of the beneficiary, or all or part of the telephone number of the beneficiary have been put forwards as potentials to be used, IBAN being one of the most common. Can we sign a hash of payment information? Due to the see what you sign, a hash would be meaningless to the end user, so it's very important that the end user has some context around what they're signing, in which case a hash would not be acceptable, and the payment information should include that beneficiary ID and amount. Moving forward from that, then how do we deal with batch or envelope transactions, large volumes of transactions in one? Then we can look at the authentication code being calculated based over the total amount of the entire envelope or batch and the ID of certain beneficiaries. And those can be selected either randomly or specifically based on risk level. And as I mentioned earlier, the amendment of whitelists for trusted beneficiaries must not happen through the TPP. This must come through from the bank. So let's have a quick look at some potential journeys, nice use case journeys that could be used for dynamic linking. Firstly, we'll look at push notification. A user would receive a push notification to their mobile device, and then they can check the transactions information on their mobile device before accepting that. And the same can be done via scanning a QR code or a Pronto code, a colored QR code. Again, an encrypted code is displayed on the screen and decrypted by the application, so the user can check that moving forwards on their mobile device to sign. Now we have to protect any devices against cloning. So the Article 7 states the possession element must be protected against cloning. What that means is if you're using a mobile application, there must be some sort of protection. With physical tokens, it's much harder to clone anyway, so that's inherently built in. So how do we do that? We include device-specific data into the calculation of an authentication code. So you might take the IMEI number or maybe the unique Android ID code to provide some sort of derivation of the response code to make it unique to one device. You can encrypt the authentication key using the secure element of a device. It's very, very hard to extract any kind of keys from a device secure element. Or finally, you can encrypt the key using a knowledge element so that the authentication key on the device is useless without that knowledge element as well. There's nothing stored locally that allows you to clone it because it's in somebody's knowledge. Moving forward, how do we then provide application security? So this is an important measure that's mentioned in Article 9. We have to be able to mitigate the risks of multi-use devices, so smartphones, for example. The use of a separated secure execution environment through the software installed inside the multi-purpose device. and mechanisms to ensure that that software has not been altered by the payer or a third party, or mechanisms to mitigate the consequences of such alteration where this has taken place. So what that means is we must have some sort of sandboxing of the OS, of the software, or application shielding, because the sandboxing is often broken on mobile device OSs by jailbreaking and rooting. Using hardware is also a way of doing that, is to protect the secrets using secure elements, but there is a lot of fragmentation around the manufacturers for support of the use of that secure element on a mobile device, so it's not always possible to do so. So some sort of application shielding is very important and necessary. And what you can do is you can use something called runtime application self-protection. That's a Gartner term, to protect your application. So the main tenets here is that you must be able to protect the application, make sure that nobody can interfere with the application itself, detect any attacks against an application, so looking for things like debuggers and emulators and jailbreak and rootkit, etc. And also ensure that the app's not being altered, so there's no code injection, no repackaging or hooking into the application. And also be able to react, so you can stop and block things like screenshotting, external screens, and importantly, if the device is under a serious attack, shut down the application when necessary and immediately. So something like a RASP scenario, a runtime application self-protection scenario, is very important where mobile applications will be used. So you need to put multiple security elements around your mobile applications. And lastly, for my presentation, I will talk about transaction risk analysis. Article 2.3 mandates the use of TRA and defines the minimum parameters. So those are the list of compromised and stolen credentials must be checked. The amount of each transaction must be checked. There must be no known fraud scenarios shown, and signs of malware present during an authentication procedure must be checked. So you need something that is monitoring transactions to check those scenarios. Article 16 does allow for low-risk transactions to be exempted from SCA if TRA meets additional conditions. So you'd be exempted from SCA if TRA meets the following: that there's no abnormal behavior of the payer, no abnormal information or behavior of the device software of the payer, no malware infection or any session in any session of the authentication procedure, and no abnormal geolocation data. So these are some of the scenarios that allow you to be exempted, but that is only up to a maximum limit of 500 euros. After that, you would have to provide both TRA and SCA regardless. So let's have a look at some of the compliance of strong authentication solutions during payment authentication. Traditional sort of one-button style of tokens do not allow for dynamic linking, so a traditional one-time password device would only be acceptable for very low-risk payments and would be unacceptable for anything above that. Moving on, transaction signing tokens with multi-line entry or visually programmable tokens, Bluetooth programmable tokens, would be capable of doing dynamic linking and therefore would be compliant and would have hardware replication protection. Mobile devices are also capable of dynamic linking as long as they have cloning protection used and some sort of root detection or RASP component is used, then they are also compliant. Looking into the mobile side, both the 2AA and 1AA scenarios are the same. You need to use a secure channel. You need to check for cloning. You need to do rootkit and RASP-style protection of the application, and then you get compliance. Looking at out-of-band, as we mentioned before, you must have information of the payment in that out-of-band communication, and through the confidentiality piece that must be secured, therefore encrypted. There must be a level of cloning protection. If you're using SIM security, you have to mitigate against things like SIM swap. And again, the independence, if rootkit is detection, then you have a conditional OK, but it's very difficult to use out of band without some sort of application layer to decrypt, for example, the information. So, to conclude, the final RTS has been adopted by the Commission and, as I said, is expected to become applicable on the 14th of September 2019. The next steps for the banks: we need to decide about the type of interfaces to be used, so dedicated versus customer-based, so the open API versus the screen scraping, and whether to use the support of fallback interfaces. Select the API standard to be used. Select the authentication models, so redirect, the embedded, or the decoupled. Ensure that all the authentication and risk analysis solutions are compliant, and provide interface specifications and testing facilities by the 14th of March 2019. And highlights regarding the strong authentication piece: we need to just reiterate that the transaction risk analysis is mandatory, even when SCA is being used. The implementation of convenient dynamic linking is going to be very important moving forwards, because there's going to be much more requirement to provide see what you sign transaction signing. And you must use some sort of secure execution environment for your mobile applications and application shielding. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a rundown of what we're seeing moving forwards with the latest RTS. I'd like to thank you all very much for your time and patience in listening. And if there are any questions moving forward, happy to take any on. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Dan. Round of applause for Dan, please.